Well, hello again. No rant this time. Just a history lecture. A short history lecture, because although I could go on and on and on, I won't here, because this is not the best time or place for that. What I wanted to bring to your attention today is a bit of history between, or perhaps I should say about, the Republican Party and the Russians. Maybe I'm the only one watching this, doing this, who remembers the good old days of the Cold War, when the Republicans and their propaganda would have us believe that the Russians were the scourge of humanity. They were godless, greedy, heathen communists who were bent on A, world conquest, and B, depriving us of each and every piece of our personal private property. You couldn't trust the Russians because they were communist, and you couldn't trust the Russians because they were Russian, and you couldn't trust the Russians because they had dominated half of Eastern Europe, hell, half of Europe, and they were influencing Africa and Asia, and the Russians were everywhere. According to Joe McCarthy, we even had communists and communist sympathizers in the State Department, in the Defense Department, in the media, in Hollywood. Russians and communists were synonymous, and they were everywhere. And the worst thing an American could do was say anything at all, even-handed, even-tempered, and open-minded about Russians, because that alone would mark them as a fellow traveler, a commie pinko spy. Now, that was 60 years ago. That was 50 years ago. And here we are today. There are those in our government who would have us believe that Vladimir Putin is a good man. He's, the best thing that ever happened to the Russian people, and he's really our friend. And, the American people just don't understand that Vladimir Putin really wants to be our friend. Yeah, right. Нельзя. Владимир Путин есть нет американская подруга. Yeah, that was Russian, after a fashion. There are reasons why I speak Russian, but I'm not going to get into them now. But today, we have a Putin puppet running our government. We have Putin sympathizers running the Congress, or at least present in the Congress, and being, well, frankly, useful idiots, to borrow a phrase that is all vogue these days. So how did things change? More to the point, why did things change? Well, I'm going to tell you. And I'm going to tell you because you need to know. We all need to understand how we got to this political quagmire so that we don't step in it again by voting for someone, if not like Donald Trump, then pretty doggone close. Now, the thing that changed the Republican attitude towards the Russians was the fall of the Soviet Union, because it was the Soviets and their communist ideology that were the real enemy of America, and American free enterprise and capitalism and all that borscht. But once communism was gone, and Russia had something sort of, kind of, almost like democracy, well, that's okay. But here's what happened. Vladimir Putin had no use for democracy any more than Vladimir Ilyich Lenin had for the Tsars. Vladimir Putin subverted Russian democracy, and he had a lot of help. And he had a lot of help from American businessmen. American businessmen had always had a presence in Russia, even in the bad old days of the Soviet Union, because the Soviet government was not stupid. They realized that they needed a little bit of capitalism to help keep them in business, as long as they could control the activities of the bourgeois capitalist. then that was okay. But when the Soviet regime fell, the bourgeois capitalists took over. They didn't just simply move into the political vacuum, they invaded it. And that's how all of the Russian oligarchs and the Russian mafia and all of those Russian bankers became so powerful and influential politically, socially, diplomatically, and yes, economically. And now, because Russia is run by capitalists, that makes them okay. Very wealthy capitalists makes them even better. Very powerful and influential capitalists makes them the best thing in the world. And that's why Donald Trump admires the Russians and admires Vladimir Putin. It's not because the Russians have any dirt on him, like videos of him consorting with hookers. No, I mean, maybe they do, but that's not really the reason why Donald Trump is so attached at the crotch to the Russians. He has such profound affection for the Russians and the Russian model because they're rich. They are rich, and they have converted their wealth into political power and political prestige, and that's exactly what he wants to do. You don't have to be Russian to have no respect for democracy. You don't have to be a Russian mafioso. You don't have to be a Russian oligarch to have contempt for democracy and the democratic process. Just look on Wall Street. Look at the boardroom of any major American corporation. They have just as much contempt for democracy and human rights and civil liberties as any Russian you'll find, or any Southeast Asian, or any Chinese corporate executive. Democracy is the antithesis of capitalism, or at least in the minds of those wealthiest of capitalists. The Russians, the Chinese, the Americans, the Japanese. Yeah, the Japanese. I'm not going to get into the Japanese right now, but they're not slackers. That's another lecture for another time. The thing that I wanted to say, the point that I wanted to make, is that Vladimir Putin has power over Donald Trump because Vladimir Putin is wealthy, he is rich, and he is politically powerful. That's why Donald Trump admires Vladimir Putin so much and will not speak ill of Vladimir Putin, because Donald Trump wants to be just like Vladimir Putin. Donald Trump wants to be an American Vladimir Putin. Vladimir Putin is Donald Trump's role model. And that's why Donald Trump will say nothing bad about Vladimir Putin, or the Russian style of government, or Russian policies, or anything pertaining to Russian political influence. Because he wants to do the same damn thing. He wants to be Vladimir Putin's surrogate in this country. He wants to do to this country what Vladimir Putin has done to Russia. And he'll probably get away with it up to a point, because there are a lot of people in Congress, and most of his supporters, most of his base, feel exactly the same way. The only thing that matters to them is money and the political power that comes with having an ungodly amount of money to just throw around and buy people, buy votes, buy policy statements, buy legislation. Now, the fact of the matter is, American corporatists have been doing that sort of thing for decades. They've been doing that sort of thing for over 100 years. That's one of the reasons we got into World War II. It's one of the reasons we got into World War I. It's the main reason why the Republican Party disavowed Teddy Roosevelt. But I digress. That's a history lecture. Save that for another time. Anyway, the point is, you need to be aware of these things. You need to understand why the Republicans are doing what they're doing. It's really very simple, as convoluted as it sometimes seems. The old adage couldn't be more true. Follow the money. Because you'll find Republicans with their hands out, either taking the money or stuffing it in their pockets all along the way. And I think that's all I have to say for right now. Until next time.